Hi, everybody. Welcome to our last edition of Mishnah Mondays for a couple of weeks. We're going to start up again in August, and we're going to jump to Tractate Yoma and start learning about Yom Kippur and the holidays. It's a particularly rich way to learn about Yom Kippur in the Mishnah. And as good timing would have it, today we've been doing this as if we were touring through the Mishnah, but the first tractate is so rich and so full of good stuff that we've been in Tractate Brachot, blessings, the entire time. And today we're going to finish Tractate Brachot, make a little siyum, in Tractate Brachot. And the last chapter is quite a doozy. We're going to be heading into some really core Jewish theology today. And you might say that it is in this last chapter that the Mishnah becomes a kind of a work of theology, though we've seen hints of that before. There's a lot of just a speculation that we'll have to do on the very nature of God and the world and things. So we'll get to that. But we're also going to be taking a kind of a surprising turn as a matter of practice. Because so far we've been looking at blessings. We've been looking at blessings and prayer, but prayer was really just a kind of, well, along the way, you remember how we got to it. Agricultural law is our sort of, is the section that we're in. And so because of that, we started thinking about eating. Because of that, we started thinking about blessing. And because of that, we started thinking about prayer in general. But if we focus on the subject of the title of the Masechet, Brachot, we're really talking about blessings, making blessings. And that's a particular institution. We spent our last session talking about how making blessings, the practice of making blessings, is a kind of a unique, new formulation the rabbis have given us. We had a notion that you would bless God after you ate food, but the rabbis took that and added to it and suggested that we ought to make blessings before we ate food. So I just want to remind you of all of that, but also lastly of the justification for that. Does anyone remember, why did we say that one should make a blessing before one eats food? Presumably, the blessing that you make after you eat food, here, let's see if I can, is a blessing of, hey, thank you, thanks for this food, that was good food. I am grateful for that food. But why make a blessing before we eat? Anyone? Anyone remember what the Talmud had to say about that? I'll show you. Talmud said, and this is just one thing that we can carry into our discussion today. Here's the original formula for blessing. You eat, you're satisfied, you give thanks. Or actually, that's already a translation. But in the translation, you can see what I mean. Uverachta, it just says, and you bless. They translate it as give thanks, which tells you that that's the presumption, that you bless in order to give thanks. But for the blessings before food, Rabbi Hanina Bar Papa said that anyone who derives benefit from this world without a blessing, it is as if he stole from God and the community of Israel. Okay? So we spent a lot of time talking about that idea that what you get from the world, God gives to you. And so in order to be able to take it, you need to acknowledge that it is a gift. You need to somehow say, hey, blessed is God for this. And if not, you're just sort of taking it, almost taking it without asking, without acknowledging. Okay, that's where we were last class, and that's going to be the last class. The whole idea of making blessings over food is the basis, the starting point, and will be helpful for us as we move into thinking about all of these other blessings that we're now going to meet. And as we begin to formulate them, one of the things we're going to see is, wow, there's a whole, you could bless there's a whole array of things that what blessing is, in other words, going to be expanded. It's going to become a much wider practice. And I suggested in the title, it's even in certain respects a way of life. You can be blessing your way throughout the day. There's a tradition that one should say 100 blessings every day, right? The Talmud says that. So, and you know, did anyone ever read Franny and Zoe, the Salinger book? There's a character there that's obsessed with the idea of I think it's in the New Testament, a phrase, pray without ceasing. And so she's trying to figure, what would it mean to pray all without ceasing, to have your whole life be a prayer? Well, blessings might be one way of doing it. There's some idea that every single thing you do, you would bless. Okay, so how do we get to that? Well, so we'll soon see. Okay, questions before we head in, Rachel.
I just want to say my favorite blessing is the one that is for seeing exceptionally strange looking people or animals. Which, I don't know, it's like a giraffe and like Steve Buscemi to me. I'm like, that's when you would say this one. I'm just obsessed with that one. That's all.
Okay, Mishnah Habriot, I think it is. The one who, blessed is the one, this is a great example. It's actually not one we're going to see today, so I'm glad you mentioned it. If you look in a prayer book under the special blessings section, you'll see blessings like this. Like, what happens when you see a strange animal and you can make the blessing, Mishnah Habriot. Blessed is the God who makes all kinds of weird creatures, right? So it's sort of an interesting, okay, like that, you make a blessing over that? Is a moment when I should make a blessing when I see a giraffe, right? Steve Buscemi, right? And why is that so? Rachel, do you want to say why you like that one so much?
Yeah, I mean, it came out of like this thing of like beauty. Like, it's just, I don't know, giraffes are so beautiful. And it came kind of out of like an argument with an ex where like he saw a giraffe and didn't tell me. And it was like, I know that sounds very strange, but it was like, it's about like, to me, it was like about sharing the beauty of the world, but it's also like, if you can't appreciate this like thing that's not ordinary, it's extraordinary, then like, what does that say about your worldview?
And what does that say about our relationship, right? If you're not going to tell me when you see it.
If you're not going to tell me you saw
This is a classic scene right there, Rachel.
Yeah.
How about that?
If you're not going to tell me you met a giraffe, what are we even doing?
What kind of connection do we have at all? Oh, I saw a giraffe yesterday. What? Okay, so, okay, okay, that's right. There's something very, in other words, there's something about a blessing that now means having in Rachel's formula, it's like kind of a wondrous experience, an exceptional experience. You should bless for that. Okay. That's a good place to be mentally when as we head into chapter 9, the last chapter of Masechet Brachot, and we're going to take a few examples. We don't have that one, though in the course of the Talmud, others will be added, like Mishnah Habriot, making all kinds of strange creatures. The first one that we have here, and let me give you this is the text sheet that we'll be looking at today, source sheet that we'll be looking at today. And here, I will share it with you. Okay. So the first one that we're going to be looking at, and I just want to say, this is a big twist. This is a big kind of pivot. It's a big move. Like, we've been discussing blessings and how to bless over food and how many people should bless. And then all of a sudden, without any kind of explanation, as the Mishnah often does, just presents a new institution without any real explanation. You can tell they're connected, but we're not given a reason why. So our job today will be to figure out what's going on here. What's the reason? Haroeh makom shenaso bo nisim liYisrael. If one sees a place where miracles have been done for Israel, right? Think about what kinds of places would those be? One says, Omer, Baruch she'asa nisim lavotenu b'makom hazeh. Blessed is the one who made miracles for our ancestors. That's almost like the Hanukkah blessing, which should give you a sense of how that might be applied in this place. Okay, and then if one sees a place from which idolatry has been uprooted, one says, Baruch she'akar avodah zara me'artzenu. Blessed is the one who removed idolatry from our land. So, okay, those are the, imagine you're just sitting there talking about, last week we were doing a bracha bee, Like, what blessing do you make over a banana? What blessing do you make over beer? What blessing do you make over? And then now all of a sudden, I'm being told, and what if you see a place where an amazing thing happened? Now, what's the logic? Somebody try to speak out the logic from making blessings over food to now making blessings over miracles, past miracles. Is there a connection, or is it just like, let's just start blessing everything? Like, what's the Yonatan?
Yeah, these are blessings of our experiences. And those experiences come through the senses. So eating is a sense, but so is seeing, right? And so when you witness a place that has some special meaning, there's a blessing that comes with that.
Okay, great. That I'm asking for some sort of connecting logic, and Yonatan gives us some great connecting logic. These are sensory experiences, he says. Eating is one sense. You have this taste sense. So is seeing. And these blessings are about a visual experience of, so I'm going to build a little bit on what you said, Yonatan. If I enjoy eating food and I'm about to get that enjoyment, and I should make a blessing to acknowledge that. So I'm also going to enjoy seeing the very place where, I don't know, where we cross the Red Sea, oh my, or the Jordan River. I'm going to make a blessing there because that's a wondrous sensory experience for my eyes. And I don't want to just take it without acknowledging that it exists as a wondrous experience because God made it so. Okay, anybody else want to do a different kind of, or a similar kind of explanation for us? Blessings over miracles that once were. Because Yonatan's example is great, except I could push back and say, well, but these are very different. This is like historical memory of something and your gratitude for that. So you say a blessing once you have seen it. After all, you don't say a blessing before you see it, say it when you see it. So that seems like a shift too. Okay, Ruth, what are you thinking? We can't hear you, Ruth.
I'm thinking that our life very much depends on what has happened before. And so I could be grateful for the settlers who may have crossed the plains so that I'm living comfortably in Los Angeles, or for the workmen who built this house so sturdily in the past. I'm benefiting from it personally.
Okay, that sounds like a good, a solid values account of what we're doing. And so I will say that what that means is it's something a little bit more like you will eat and be satisfied and bless the Lord your God, right? It's like I'm thankful for all these good things in my life. I'm thankful for the history that's brought me here. I'm thankful for the house I live in. But it's a little bit of a like, oh, I got it, and now I'm acknowledging it, which just makes me feel like the rabbis are, I don't want to say playing fast and loose. They can do whatever they want, but it's just like, there's not specific rules for a blessing. It's like, we've got this institution. Let's just start using it for all kinds of good reasons. Okay, Wendy, what do you think?
I think I'm building upon what Yonatan and Ruth said. I think that it's also a way of showing us how everything in our lives is connected to God. When we're blessing God for bringing us this food. We're blessing God for having performed miracles before. We're blessing God for every part of our existence, whether it be physical or spiritual or historical.
Okay, good. Wendy's got a great theory now of blessings that might help create a larger category. It's not just, oh, there's food and let's just use it for other things. No, now we realize, or the rabbis are helping us realize, or they realize themselves, that what blessings are about is an awareness of God, having an awareness of God. That's why you make a blessing before you eat. You want to just, what are you really offering God with the blessing? Just the awareness. Yes, of course, this food came from you. So everything came from God. So what blessings do is just keep us and eventually I'll make a blessing after going to the bathroom, and eventually I'll make a blessing before every mitzvah, and eventually but it's just like in every one of those moments, this too is from God, this too is from God, this too is from God. Okay, that's certainly one way of looking at blessings. All right, that version that Wendy just gave us will help us also make sense of the next Mishnah, which we'll look at in a sec. But before we leave this one, I want to ask just one more question. Miracles that God did for our ancestors, lovely. But why also a blessing specifically for a place from which idolatry has been uprooted? So like there are two just as the two opening blessings. One is just all the great stuff that's ever happened to us that God did for us. And then specifically a little blessing for the uprooting of idolatry. Like, I don't know, why does that need its own blessing? Why isn't it in the first blessing? Why is it important at all? This seems like a strange coupling there. Yeah, Nick, what do you think?
I mean, historically, doesn't it also represent sort of, I mean, I imagine it's connected to like, you know, winning battles and taking of land, because like usually during like the destruction of, well, let's say like during a battle when one people took over the other, their gods and their houses of worship were destroyed. So it also seems like a symbolism of victory and an assertion of sort of like God's autonomy. Like I feel like it's connected to military victory in some way.
Yeah, that's a great theory. The miracles that were done for our ancestors, well, that's like God splitting a sea. But when idolatry is uprooted, usually God doesn't uproot the idolatry God's self. We like come in and conquer an idolatrous place, or history just, you know, fades some nation. Like it doesn't seem like that's a miraculous thing. So Nick is saying also in the natural course of events, we recognize that God is also a part of that. In which case, yes, these two blessings are very complementary. One is about the supernatural and one is about the natural, and both of them we bless God for the good developments of history. Rachel?
I'm sort of jumping off that. I don't know if this is, I get it more from the first half, but in terms of like thinking about when we're taken over, like I was thinking about the Jews during like the plague era in England, like some of them would wear crosses so that people wouldn't know they were Jews, or at least according to this one historical fiction book I read. So it's like, what is the difference between surviving and thriving? Like you can be thankful for surviving, but what does it mean to actually thrive? And if the Jews in Egypt were just surviving, us leaving there is the beginning of a chance to thrive, and it's two very different ways of life. Okay, beautiful. These sorts of distinctions are exactly the sort of thinking that I think that the catalog of blessings is asking us to do. On the one hand, we have Wendy's framework, which allows us to see all of blessings as a certain kind of practice, and all of those blessings bringing a certain kind of consciousness. But in as much as we have various, but we don't just always say, bless God for that, bless God, bless God, bless God. We say blessings for specific things. We're also invited to think, well, what is the difference between the various kinds of experiences that require different kinds of blessings? Like, we know the difference between a carrot and an apple, right? So, okay, further to the ground, further to the tree. We talked about that a little bit. But what is the difference between a military victory and a miracle? What is the difference between surviving and thriving? What are the different kinds of experiences that we want to single out and say, oh, for this too, we ought to compose a blessing? So here are another couple of examples. Some great ones, some classics. And these are all birchot riyah, things that you see. On comets, by the way, next week there is a comet Neowise that it will be visible from very high places. So speaking of blessings as a way of life, like this would be an opportunity. You go to the mountain, you see the comet, you make the blessing, okay? So blessings are now becoming, it's not just when you sit down to eat, all over the place. Okay, so on comets, on Comet, on Cupid, on different on earthquakes,
on lightning, on thunder, or on windstorms, ruchot, ramim, brakim, zivaot, and zikim, one says, Baruch shekocho ugvurato malei olam. Blessed is the one whose strength and might fill the world. And then speaking of distinction, so I could ask you what this would be about, but I'm sure some of you would say, well, the wonder of the natural world. Okay, but speaking of distinctions, we started making distinctions in the last Mishnah. Then there's on mountains, al harim va'al gvaot va'al yamim va'al naharot va'al midbarot. On mountains, hills, seas, rivers, or deserts, one says, Baruch oseh maseh bereshit. Blessed is the one who made creation. Okay, who made the work of creation. Okay, so now let's do that same work. What category are these blessings? Why do we need these blessings as well? Let's see. Raise hand. Nick, what's up?
I was actually going to say, and I guess in a way I'll answer your question, that like typically we're affected by the natural world, and there's a tendency to, if we see clouds giving us rain, to praise clouds. If we see a tree giving us fruit, we praise the fruit. And it seems like these blessings, these specific blessings, are a good safeguard against like idolatrous naturalistic practices. And in a way, it just like keeps reminding us that like where everything comes from. It's like not necessarily the tree, it's from God, right?
Yeah, I think what Nick is saying is really important, because the answer I guess I sort of would have given myself or naturally expected from you is like, well, the world is a wondrous place. It's amazing to see lightning. Make a blessing. It's wondrous. But what Nick is saying is that, yeah, it's a wondrous place, but there's also there's a pitfall there. You see lightning, you might worship the lightning, right? Especially the Bible is worried about that. But just as a matter of general Jewish theology, make sure to appreciate nature through the lens of creation, of God. Allison, what do you think?
Well, I love what Nick just offered. And I also, I wonder if there's also part of it that in our theology, there's like a connection between like appreciating God, but then also that's tied to our own responsibility, right? Like we have a covenant. And I kind of fell behind in reading the Torah portions. And then this week I read Parshat Balak as well as Pinchas. And what really struck me in Balak was you have like God going to such far lengths to prevent Balaam from cursing the nation of Israel. And so we really see that like God is not gonna, like Hashem is not gonna allow the nation of Israel to be cursed. And then at the end of the Torah portion, of course, we have like the Israelites are the ones that kind of give into their own Yetzer Hara and allow themselves to stray. And so, I don't know, I think there's maybe this kind of beautiful thing where in blessing God in these different moments, maybe it both acknowledges Hashem, but then also might act as a sort of reminder that we also have a responsibility in our own behavior towards this world.
That's really interesting. I mean,
I have no idea.
It does build on the last comments, because both of these, both Allison's and Nick's formulations allow for the possibility of blessing as a kind of a cautionary, blessing as a safeguard, and that, after all, that language around blessings was in the Talmud's formulation from the start, right? It's like you'd be stealing if you didn't, or thinking something theologically wrong, or just being, as opposed to being in this experience of wonder and joy. Oh my gosh, I got to make a blessing. There's a kind of, you're guarding against something as well. It's really, yeah. David, what were you thinking?
Well, a little bit along those lines. It feels like the past and the future. I mean, you're one is the blessing for creation that's already happened, and the other one is for the gifts that may come. It feels like the future. We want to feel your power, God. We want we want those gifts going forward in the future.
Good. So David is doing the next piece, which is, okay, great. So we have some natural kind of nature blessings, but what's the difference between them? And David is saying, well, comets, wind, earthquakes, those are things that happen suddenly. And so there's a kind of an acknowledgement of the things that can come to be, that can appear in nature. That's a certain kind of acknowledgement. God's power can manifest in the world. Well, it's different to say, oh, I bless this mountain, because that's saying something that God created, the world as it stands. So these are actually very fundamentally different kinds of nature experiences that call for very different kinds of blessings. So I like that. And speaking of which, the next example also is a different kind of blessing. Rabbi Yehuda suggests that the one who sees the great sea, which is probably the ocean, not just the Mediterranean, but the ocean. If you see the ocean, you should say a particular blessing for that, right? So we're also thinking about very specific kinds of experiences that might require very specific kinds of blessings. Okay, we could play around with this for a while. You're starting to see how the various blessings that you'll find in your prayer book might be formulated. Is this enough? Are there other kinds of natural experiences that should have a blessing to themselves? Okay, you could think about that, but I want to take us to the next piece here, because one of the things that chapter 9 offers us is this sort of panoply of blessings that expands our sense of what blessings are about. That's important. But the other major thing that happens in brachot is a kind of a theological, assertion, investigation. There's a theology being offered here, but in a way that is at least not totally clear to me. Like, I think this is what we need to spend a lot of time on today. Is this next blessing, and then we're going to see various other formulations of it. But let's just start with the blessing. Al hagshamim va'al habasorot tovot, on rain, which was the classic sort of thing that was needed, desired, prayed for in ancient Israel, and on good news in general, basorot tovot. One says, Baruch hatov v'hametiv, blessed is the one who is good and does good. And then, al shmuot ra'ot, but when you hear bad news, one says, Baruch dayan emet. And some of you may be familiar with this formulation. We say it most classically when someone dies. In fact, it almost is a stand-in for the shock and the inability to say anything in sort of traditional Jewish communities. When someone dies, when you hear of it for the first time, you say, oh, Baruch dayan emet. But what you're saying there is, blessed is the true judge. Now, what does that mean? Let's just start there. On good news, you say, blessed is God, God is so good. Awesome. But why would you say, when you hear bad news, Baruch dayan emet? Yonatan?
I think there's a sort of acknowledgement that I may be dissatisfied to hear this news, but God's judgments are still true.
Okay, I think that's right. On the simplest level, we are being, now this is like a big ask, we're being asked to treat bad news as if it is something that seems bad to us, but must be the right thing from the perspective of the all-knowing God who sees the big picture. Anybody want to disagree with that or offer a different interpretation? David?
Well, it feels to me like no matter what, you must be grateful to God. It also reminds me of why we say Kaddish, when someone dies. I mean, you just, and that has really no acknowledgement of, but it's just the praise of God. And that's the most important thing to do.
No matter what, just always be praising God. Okay. Who else had a hand up? Pam.
Yeah. So a couple of things on the death of a person. It's almost as if to say their life was a blessing, and whether we realize it or not, their work here was done. That doesn't really hold up when you hear of tragedies like Ruby and Hart, right? But the idea that in every tragedy, although we can't see it in that moment, there's a blessing somewhere. There's a hidden blessing, right? There's a learning that comes from that. There is an awareness that comes from that. It will lead to other deeds in our lives that will cause blessing. Out of every painful situation, no matter how horrible it is, there are blessings there. We just can't see them in that moment.
Okay, I see a lot of hands. I'm gonna just let people continue to interpret this. But as we do, and I think Pam put it very eloquently, but I also want us to consider what do we think of that theology? I mean, and Pam gave us a place to really, at the death of children, are we really being asked to say, I'm sure that God has a plan? Like, is that, like, what exactly?
I don't know that there's necessarily a plan, and there's some horrible things that we can't possibly, one doesn't negate the other. The fact that there's a blessing and something to learn from it does not negate the tragedy of what's happened.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Jamie.
I think I was going to say the same thing that she just said, but I just appreciate that there's an opening here for sadness and the sense of tragedy when someone dies, because we're not saying in that moment, we could say, let's just have a celebration, blessed be the one who's good and does good. Right. What difference does it make? So the theology isn't necessarily, everything that God does is good and needs to be celebrated. There is an opening and an acknowledgement that this is a tragedy. We are going to feel sad. And we're not just going to sing and dance like we would for other things that elicit positive feelings in us. And so we're going to put it in the realm of judgment, and it's going to require a little bit more thought, contemplation, sitting with it to, see that it is maybe not the death itself is a blessing, but that there is blessing around it, maybe.
Okay, good. That's a very important comment that Jamie's made. On the one hand, we are being asked to make a blessing over bad news. So there's something that's a very bold request and a very bold theology that God would be, even in our worst moments, called like the true judge. The one blessed is the true judge, the one who judges. But Jamie is saying, but that's not the same thing as just blessing over everything. Like, we have a blessing that God is good and does good. You might think, if we were really being asked to see God, everything is just part of God's great plan, you might think, well, that we just use that blessing across the board. There are different blessings for good and bad news. And in fact, the one for bad news doesn't speak of God's goodness. It speaks of a judgment that God made. Okay, that acknowledges this is not, we find a way of blessing God, but this is not good. It's not saying, oh, this is good. This is sadness. But then I guess I want to just like tag on to that. Like, but why say a blessing for that? But I guess I'm attached to the idea that a blessing is a moment of celebration. Maybe it's not. Maybe now a blessing means something else. You can bless God even when you are distraught. Right? Hannah.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the fact that the tragedies or the hard things or the difficult days are just as much an experience of being human as anything else. And so I wonder about thinking of blessing as acknowledgement, as opposed to some kind of inherent value of good or of gratitude, but just of recognition of a moment as being worthy of acknowledgement. And that happens in bad and that happens in good, that happens in a rainbow and that happens in a flood. Like there's some acknowledgement that there are powers outside of our own that are at work in some way here. And that's true for good, and that's true for things we don't understand. But that there's a necessity to remember that all of that is part of the miracle of being a person, and that our experience of being alive has to cover all of these things underneath that umbrella, and that we're lucky in a lot of ways to be present, to be able to witness all of this vast spectrum of what it means to be alive. And if all we care about is recognizing when things are good, we're going to be disappointed a lot of the time, because there's something sacred in all of it.
Beautifully put. Beautifully put. And the very theme of acknowledgement takes us back to that piece of Talmud that says, oh, you kind of have to acknowledge God before you eat. It's not just about thanking God. It's about saying, whoa, I need to acknowledge this. What you're saying is, yeah, the blessing is connected back to God, but part of it is just acknowledging, whoa, this is a profound experience. This is an experience I must pause and take note of, for the bad or for the good, but it's a profound, yeah. Allison.
Hey, I love what Hannah just said, because it really ties in well to what I'm about to say, which is that word judgment makes me think of the Sephirot, the tree of life. And it's kind of interesting that, like, when we count the Omer, the first week is chesed, like love and kindness. And then it's balanced by the second week by din and gevurah, like that they're two sides of the same branch of the tree of life. And, you know, obviously when bad things happen, it's a terrible loss, but maybe, I mean, it's difficult, right? But maybe part of feeling the intensity of that loss, that deep, you know, sorrow at a death, it's the flip side of the fact that we really loved. Yeah. So we have to bless, you know, the fact that we experienced what we had, even though it was taken.
Okay, good. As you kind of place it into the spherotic tree there, you're really talking about a kind of a balancing where there are different forces in the world, and like we have to kind of see those forces, the good, the bad, the fierce, the gentle, the loving, the judging. All of those things are sort of, there's a kind of a balance of forces in our world. And so these blessings over the bad and the good are asking us to sort of like contend with that harmony, and kind of be open to the fact that that is the nature of things. Those are the various forces of the world. Okay, Nick and Wendy.
Yeah, I think what Hannah said really harmonizes a lot of my discomfort with this idea. In that Hannah, you know, from what I heard, what I took away from the comment was that we need to acknowledge that God is responsible for all things, and that's a very difficult idea. You know, I think if we just think of like God as being responsible for the good things, then we run, again, it's sort of like a moment of running the risk of like developing a theology of like God and the devil that you might find in Christianity, for example, to relegate all good things to God and all bad things to the devil. And then it becomes not a monotheistic system, but like a bitheistic, or whatever the terminology would be, system. At the same time, I have a lot of discomfort with this idea of, I mean, it's very charged, like judgment, like blessing the true judge, the idea of like, you know, judgment during the high holidays is like a central theme to sort of making sense of why people live and why people die. So I think that's a very thorny thing to talk about. And I just watched Coco again last night, so that's, you know, life and death very, very much on my mind. But for me, it's a moment of like, death is such an upending event in one's life, for those who are still living and for those who die. And it seems like saying this blessing is just a moment of like, of maybe like putting like something on that moment so the floor doesn't fall out of your whole life, you know? And I've been watching a lot of Grey's Anatomy. There's a great scene where there's this Rabbi character who ends up coming in, and he's helping one of these doctors going through something, and he's dying, and she just wants to know, like, why does all this bad stuff keep happening? And he just says, well, why did Sarah have to wait so long to like have a child? Why did all these terrible things happen? It's like, the answer is we don't get to know. Who are we to know? And I think that for me, at least, not solves, but just sort of like satisfies some of the discomfort with judgment and the whys and the hows and the ifs and the whens, of just the chaos of losing somebody.
Yeah. So the Baruch Dayan Emet, the blessed is the true judge, is not really a statement of God has judged this to be so and I accept that verdict. It's more a way of saying, like, who freaking knows? Like, it's just whatever. I guess God has some idea, but who knows, right? And that's a sentiment that I too, it feels a little more true to the experience of those moments. Wendy?
I loved hearing what you had to say, Nick. I've had a very difficult time with this phrase, always, because death is, sometimes we think of it inexplicable, and yet it is a part of life. And then I started thinking, I think maybe that this blessing is a way for us to realize that we are still supposed to live and that our life counts. A judge is somebody who witnesses, who takes in all things. And when we're saying that God, is the true judge, life has not ended for us. We are still, what we do counts as we continue our life. And then we say, when somebody dies, may that person's memory be a blessing. May we continue to do good in the world, because there's somehow that notion of God as judge. Maybe we are the judge. We judge ourselves. We judge the people around us. We judge what's going on in the life around us every day. How can we judge our life as we're still here living? How do we live and make our lives like a blessing?
Okay, I want to continue to take thoughts. I think I saw Bob had a hand. I think I saw Arlene out there had a hand up. As we're coming to the end of our hour, though, I also want to just make sure that we see this theme that we just have introduced of the good and the bad in the realm of blessings. This is a theme that actually the rest of the chapter seems like we're going to keep listing blessings, but it's almost like the Mishnah can't shake this idea. Like, once you introduce the idea that you should bless over bad things, the rabbis, just like you, are a little bit like in a state of uncertainty around it. So there are three formulations of the blessing over good and bad in the Mishnah. I just want to throw another one out as we continue to chew on this. So we have two different blessings: Baruch Hatov Meitiv for the good, blessed is the one who is good and does good. And then for bad news, Baruch Dayan Emet, blessed is the true judge. Now take a look at the next Mishnah. First of all, we get Shechianu, which is like, one of the all-time best blessings. When you've built a new house or bought new vessels, you say, Baruch Shechianu, blessed is the one who has kept us alive. Okay, so yet another. And if we weren't in this good and evil kind of discussion, we would spend some time just thinking about Shechianu. But for today's class, I want to continue to dig down the question that we've been turning over just now, because here's another formula. It's almost like out of order. It's almost like the Mishnah is like, well, let's move on. No, we can't move on. And here's another formulation, a little bit different. And I actually, to tell you the truth, I don't understand how to read this exactly, so I'm going to try to read it for you, and then you'll tell me what you think. Mevarech al hara me'ein hatova, va'al hatova me'ein hara'a. Okay, here's another good and bad formulation. I don't exactly know. One blesses over the evil just as one blesses over the good, or over the good just as one blesses over evil. The language in Hebrew is very difficult to translate. Me'ain is it's like, but not exactly. So when we say that sometimes Shabbat is me'ain olam haba, it's like the world to come. It's not actually the world to come, but it's it has that sense, that essence in it. So what does it mean? Here's a wait, we got the two blessings, but now this is a general statement. You bless on the bad, sort of as if it were the good, or no, like in the spirit of the good, and on the good in the spirit of the bad, as if it were the bad. But yeah, I'm not sure what translation even to use. But does this add at all? I'll turn it back out to you. Does this add at all to our understanding of what it means to bless over the good and the bad? I'll tell you, by the way, before I open it up, because it is a little like mysterious what exactly this means. The commentators, the Maimonides, for example, understands this to be, well, this has got to mean something else. And what he suggests it means is, if something is bad, even if you know it will eventually become good, like your field is flooded, but the next year you know that that'll be good for irrigation, you still bless Baruch Dayan Emet, bad news. And similarly, if something is good, even though you know eventually it's going to get bad, like you see this incredible canyon before you and it's spectacular, but it actually makes the journey more difficult, you still, maybe that's not a good example, but you see what I'm saying. The logic is you bless on the good and the bad. The truth is, like, I can't really does anyone understand what this means? Anyone have a reading, Rachel?
Part of what I see in this is, so I grew up in the South, not around a lot of Jews. So a lot of my understanding is like Judaism versus some of the Christianity I was exposed to. And something that I love about Judaism is how we don't have the concept of original sin. And so for me, when I look at that, if we're saying the same thing over good and evil, then there actually can't be as distinct as we want to think. Then nothing is pure good, nothing is pure evil. And I do think there are exceptions to that, obviously, but it's like, it makes life more gray. And then you have to like find the good and the bad and the bad and the good. And just like this idea, it gives people a redemption path to me too. Like you can become better. Like we're not on this linear process of being good. And then, I mean, the language is difficult with these blessings, but it makes me think of this folk song, Call Down a Blessing. And it's not saying call down a good blessing, call down a bad blessing, but it's like, we have to have something to say when things are bad. Like, you know, like no one necessarily knows what to say. And the language doesn't necessarily give me solace, but the idea that I can have something to say that doesn't say everything happens for a reason, or like, well, I don't know if those two thoughts make sense, but it's just, I've never really responded to, as Nick was saying, like, bad is Satan and good is God. Like that's too extreme for me.
Good. So that's one way of looking at this move that the Mishnah makes, right? We had this kind of surprising thing that you make a blessing over bad. So now, like, bless everything. But as Jamie pointed out, well, but you make a different blessing for bad than good, so there are different kinds of experiences. But maybe the Mishnah is kind of turning around, though, and saying, you know, in the first part of your comments, what Rachel said, that, yeah, they are separate experiences, but on some level, it's all one experience. On some level, these experiences are not as far apart. Like, everything is sourced in, I don't know, the Tao, like the way things are. And you just, like, be in a, like, blessing is a way of life. Be in a state of blessing because, yeah, like, you'll experience things differently, but on some level, we have to recognize there's a kind of me'ain. Everything's like everything else. Everything is fundamentally from God in some way, and that's the consciousness we're tapping into. I'm not ascribing all of that theology to what Rachel said, but it's certainly a possible way of making sense of this sort of second turn. Arlene, you've had your hand up. Sorry, for some reason, Arlene, you're on my second screen, and so I didn't catch you for a while there, but go ahead.
Okay. Well, I was thinking of about the idea about blessing evil and good. It's just that this could be related to the idea of sometimes things happen that are very, very bad, but and they seem like so overburdened. Like, how are you gonna overcome this? About the political will and about a community's will. So, for example, it's really sad that the first and second temple, got destroyed, and we had sacrifices, animals, but then we did the rabbinical Judaism, then you have the prayers and the sense of community and everything. So even with everything that we do, like right now with a Black Lives Matter and what happened with George Floyd's killing and racism, it's like we can do nothing, or we can change.
That's great. Arlene, your interpretation is great because it does make sense of, like, it felt to me, I gave you the Rambam, the Maimonides kind of understanding of this phrasing, like, well, sometimes there are things that are good, but eventually they'll become bad, or things that are bad. Like, they're trying to put these formulations into distinct categories. But what you're saying is that there's a way in which good does sometimes lead to bad. That's actually a real experience we need to take account of in the world. Sometimes the worst things actually, right, people will speak of the state of Israel as being like a result of the Holocaust. I'm not endorsing or criticizing that theology. I'm just saying, like, that's a classic version of, we needed a terrible thing to get to a good thing. And maybe part of it, you have different blessings for good and bad. And the Mishnah is saying, make sure you acknowledge the experience you're in, but also acknowledge that this builds on the theology that I think Rachel was offering us. Like, in some ways it's all one, and not only is it all one experience, but what is up right now might eventually go down, what is down might eventually go up, and there's a kind of unpredictability that only, you might say, only God knows the way this will eventually play out, and we have to be conscious of that. Like, what's happening in this country around racism is terrible, but maybe will lead to a real blessing. Am I gonna say, blessed is God who, I don't know, led to this death? No, but maybe I have some sense that part of what I'm doing when I say Baruch Dayan Emet, blessed is the true judge, is I'm saying, well, this may eventually become a Tova Meitiv thing, but that picture is too complicated for me to get. Okay, Bob.
Yeah, so I think I'm looking at this now, maybe somewhat similarly, but maybe with a different nuance, and not that good will become bad and bad will become good, but going back real briefly to the previous one of good news and bad news and blessed be the true judge. I was having, trouble with those two, as I think others were, and even starting to think that the bad news, blessed be the true judge, is the one that you really have to think hard about and like really force yourself to say that. And I think someone gave the example of, mourner's Kaddish, and at least, it's always my understanding, of our tradition. It's like it really, forces you at a really bad time to, still talk about God and bless God. So almost putting those two in juxtaposition with each other, that maybe one is harder, one is more important. And now this other way of looking at it, evil just as the good, or good just as the evil, it's really saying, don't look at one as being more important or being harder to do. It's like, you just have to, I think as someone said, I think as you said, Rabbi, it's like, just look at the need to say the blessings. It doesn't matter if one is hard and one's easy, they're blessings, and you need to keep that in mind. And that should be what you're doing, regardless of whether it's hard or difficult.
Okay, I love that. Thank you for that framework, Bob, because I first of all, I think it's an important point to make, right? That we introduced the idea of saying blessings over comets and hills and things, and you're starting to get the feeling like blessings are about wonderful experience, marvelous experiences. And then all of a sudden, and then we get this blessing, like whenever you hear good news, whenever you hear, and then all of a sudden there's this blessing that says, well, what about the bad stuff? Like, And that's going to be hard. That's going to be hard to make those blessings, Bob is saying. And so there are certain, if blessings aren't just about acknowledging wondrous experiences, but as Hannah said, acknowledging all of the profound experiences of life, Bob is adding, it's simply not as easy to do that. And there are certain blessings that it will take more, they won't be as intuitive. It'll take more strength. Now, I especially appreciate that comment because it brings us to the last formulation here of, remember I said, once we introduce the idea that there are blessings over the good and blessings over the bad, it's almost like it's this theme that continues as sort of the rabbis continue to tease out. So we got the blessing of the good and the blessing of the bad, and then we have this formulation that now we've been working through, that one is sort of like the other, right? So with Bob's thoughts in mind, that nevertheless, they all may be part of one big plan, but some of them it's harder sometimes to make a blessing. Take a look at this last formulation of what it means to bless good and bad. It's a completely different formulation, but I think it fits into the place we're at in our conversation. There's some other great blessings here that we're just going to, like blessings what you say when you enter a city, blessings you say when you leave a city. Now look at this is the last Mishnah in Brachot. And it uses language that feels very familiar. One must bless on the evil just as one blesses on the good. Great, we've heard that now a couple of times before. But listen to this particular formulation. As it says in the Shema, and you shall love the eternal your God, b'chol levavcha, with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your might. So what does it mean to love God with all of your heart? That is, with both your impulses, the evil impulse as well as the good impulse. V'yetzer tov u'v'yetzer ra. Okay, now that's weird. That's like a completely different version of the same basic kind of concepts that we've been playing with. One should bless on the evil just as one blesses on the good. That sounds familiar. But what that means is, says this Mishnah, is that you have parts of you that are evil and parts of you that are good, and you should bless God with both of those parts. Now, what in the heck does that mean? I was going to ask, but now at least we have one answer. Bob's answer is, if I may riff on it a little bit, Bob, Bob's answer is the evil part of you, that part doesn't want to bless God. That part's like, to hell with you. My life sucks. This world sucks. I'm not interested. I don't recognize it. Force that part of you to bless God. Okay, that's just one. You don't have to accept that formula, but let's try it. This is the third and kind of in some ways strangest version of what it means to bless good and bad, is that you use both desires, the desire for bad and the desire for good are both parts of yourself. I don't know. What do you think of this? Let's see who's got hands up here. Nick.
I was just going to say, I kind of love this because I think that it gives permission for us to say like we're imperfect, as opposed to say like I also don't really like the idea that when we go to prayer we have to be happy and joyful, because that's just not like how humans are all the time. Sometimes the most meaningful prayer moments I think can be when we're broken and when we're sad, because it's meaningful when we're able to come to the moment with honesty. But I like this because it instead of forcing us to like suppress what we think may be bad behavior or bad thoughts or bad feelings, it's like, look, just have them all, and just know that they all come from the same source, and that is what it is, and it's just do your best.
Okay. Okay. Real quick, because we're out of time, I see Allison's got a hand up and Wendy's got a hand up. If you can make it quick.
Super quick. I've been watching Rami on Hulu, and it's really interesting because they always make a big deal of like how they have to wash and be totally clean before they pray. It's like Muslims. And it just made me curious when we started talking about that. Do Jews have anything like that? Do we care? Yeah.
Before you pray?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, very much so. Yeah, one is supposed to wash one's hands before prayer.
Interesting. Okay. Because it kind of made me think of like, what can we bring? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, in general, Muslim practice is the closest to ours in the pantheon of world religions. Wendy?
So, two things. It reminds me of the Yiddish saying, one cannot know the sweet without knowing the bitter. And this is the world that we live in has both honey and vinegar. It's both, sometimes 49%, 51%. And the other thing is that, yes, absolutely, each one of us has good and bad. And this is the struggle, this is a journey of life. And we say that we are closest to God when we have been in those dark places and turned ourselves around from it and asked forgiveness. So I think it's inextricably an important part of life, and to bless that evil, to acknowledge it, to know that this is not something that we stay in. This is what life is about movement away from it, but it's a constant movement and it's a constant journey.
Great. So we continue on that journey, and I will not say that I leave this conversation having like understood or made sense of this dilemma that the Mishnah introduces us, which is that blessing is such a way of life that it includes blessing over terrible things. But we've seen various formulations of it, and we've seen at least some parallel between the divine realm, where good and bad are coming to us from, let's call it above, but also from below. There's good and bad inside of us, and that's a lot to make sense of. I mean, are we supposed to think that God has got a big plan or not? Like, it actually all gets very confusing and very hard to make a coherent theology out of. And maybe part of what these various kind of formulations are doing is just saying, look, it is complicated, but our goal is to be in a state of blessing, right? That, forget about what's actually true. It is a good practice to be in blessing, and we'll try and figure out how to do it even when we don't feel like it, whether because we're being kind of selfish or we're having a bad moment, or whether the world is dealing us a bad fate. Nevertheless, somehow we're going to figure out a way to use this practice of blessing, of acknowledgement, of awareness, and try to figure out a way to bring it to all these various and complicated experiences that the world presents us. And that actually is a pretty radical spiritual practice. That's a bold claim, if there ever was one, which is that you will have a series of experiences in your life. Try nevertheless to be in a state of blessing throughout it all. That's I think a hard thing to do. All right, I have to jump off really quick today, but great discussion. We are off for 2 weeks, not next week and not the week after. We'll join again August, first week of August, and start studying Yoma, the tractate devoted to the Avoda service of Yom Kippur. Thanks, everybody. I'll see you later this week, I hope. Okay? Bye.